Okay, I think we should be good now. On Facebook it should. Okay. We're not on YouTube right now, but I will take that down. Good. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Are we good? Can y'all hear? Do I need to turn the mic up? Yes, no? Yes, turn it up. Turn it up. Okay. I'm going to try. Whoop, whoop. Any better? Yes, yes. Huh? It's very bassy. That was what I was going for. Hold on. Thank goodness that Kate and Joey are here. Thank you for the space and for the beers. And for the beers on Sunday. Yeah, that's a history moment too. Is this better? I'm still a little bassy. A little bit? Okay. Well, y'all, while we're tinkering with it, for those who don't know me, I'm Melissa Keller, and I am the Executive Director of the Museums of Historic Hopkinsville-Christian County. Thank y'all for coming out tonight to History on Tap. We've been doing programs this way for a couple of years now. We started, actually 3 years now. We started with 4. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm glad that there's someone holding me accountable in the room. 4 years now, we started this when the museum was closed for renovations, and it just caught on and went so well that we wanted to keep it going. So thank you all for coming out and learning a little bit about some of Hoptown's history. This is clearly a topic of interest to me too, so I am so excited. I've heard a little bit about this over the years, but not very much. So I'm very thankful for our scholar friend and historian Wynn Radford for reading newspapers like a crazy person and learning as much as he could about the time that the federal grand jury listed a whole set of indictments against our local city government. So, what a thing to talk about tonight. All right, so here you go. Welcome, Wynn.
I know the last time we did this, we didn't have a microphone and didn't pull stuff like that. If for some reason I get it and you can't hear me, just stick your head up. You know, we're all one way. I won't matter about here. I'm here. I guess about 6 months or so, I asked Melissa, I said, listen, what do you know about Fort Campbell shutting Hopkinsville down back in the early 50s? And I talked to a couple of other people, and what I found out about is nobody really knew exactly. And then Alyssa said that you realize that you could go to the online, and go to Google Newspaper Archives, and all of the newspapers are there for the Kentucky New Era. And so, during UK law that I had never heard of before. So I started taking notes, and it is, as our daughter said, she goes, well, that has turned into quite the homework assignment. And that's a good way of describing it. So that's kind of it. And let me also say, I'm only going to be able to discuss probably about half of what's in this paper, the notes, everything I've written. So if anybody wants to see more, and there's a lot more, just say something to Alyssa, and she'll give you my email or a copy of the paper, and you can get it. Okay. It's all there. And then also, if you get the paper, you'll see like 4552. That just goes to Kentucky New Era on that date, and you'll see where I pulled the information from. I know I'm throwing a lot of disclaimers out here. What you're going to hear are facts. Okay? Very little of my opinion. I'm speaking literally, here's what was reported in the Kentucky New Era. And then, well, that's about it. Now, everyone, I hope, either has or has access to kind of the timeline. And if not, time to give us more if it is like. But there's a timeline, and we're going to touch on those. We're not going to go down all of them, because we would be here forever. And then I want to try to be very respectful of your time to talk maybe 30, 40 minutes. And what I really want to do is hopefully there's some people in this room who say, I remember or I've heard. And that's what I really want to hear about. And we'll kind of compare notes a little bit. So you should have a copy of that. And then you'll also should have a copy of all of the different bars and the bars, the taverns, and the juke joints that were in operation back in the early 50s. And then also, which is very much a part of this story, it's the tourist courts, north of they enter into this as well. So there they are. I'm not going to go, just to save time, I'm not going to go down all of them. But I do think this is important, which is kind of ironic. Here we are, and who can remember where the city police station was back in the 50s? Bill? Yeah, it's where Hickson Dibbs Law Firm is. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about took place pretty much where we are. A couple of other bars. There was a lot of activity up and down there. And then you go over to Clay Street. And that's kind of like the strip, if that's what you want to call it. You've got a lot of places that were in there. And I kind of vaguely remember some of those places. And just by driving by. And then you've got another couple of places, say from fire station down toward the railroad station, where the donut place is. So the bottom line is, if you were a soldier, or if you were a North Christian coal miner, or you were a South Christian farmer, on the weekends, this is kind of where you come to have a good time. Right? There's a lot of locations like this. And then one of the things that got me intrigued with this is that I had heard that they shut Hopkinsville down and there were tanks on the side outside of town. That didn't happen. And then somebody also said that they not only shut down Hoptown, they shut down Dawson Springs, Mannington, Crofton, the whole, everything around here. And I think at the end of the day, they didn't shut it down, but they shut down certain locations. And that's what we're going to talk about. And I did not do a PowerPoint presentation just because we know most of these places. And we drive by them every day. We just don't know what happened. I'll kind of try to describe some of these different things that happen. And Jennifer Brown did a really good job of describing this as the scandalous pictures. And it was. But I think in the big picture, when we look back now, it's been almost 70 years, is that we need to ask ourselves, what happened within the community where about 350 people got together, led by Dr. Gabe Payne and others, and formed a committee which I'd never heard before called the Citizens for a Good Government Committee. Anyone ever heard of that? We're going to talk about it. And then what did that decision, how did that really impact Hopkinsville? Because what happened in there, they changed from a city commissioner form of government, which were 3 city commissioners, to the 12 city council members and mayor that we have now. And at the end of the day, and I thought this was a great quote, after all the hoopla, Mayor Chester Forte, he was talking to the Kiwanis Club, and he just said, communities get the kind of government they want. And I thought that was pretty good. So in kind of in the background, let me just mention this, on the national news, you had the Korean War, Eisenhower, you had the recent Brown versus Board of Education case. Everybody across the United States was wrestling with that. Statewide, Barkley and Cooper were running for the Senate. You probably heard about this. There was a lot of discussion about vice and corruption in Newport and Henderson. Okay? So that was getting a lot of the news from the Courier-Journal, more so than probably Hopkinsville was. And then locally, you had people, which we take for granted, but people were starting the Pennywater Fair, Bethel College, your enrollment was up, College Industries was coming to town, and then New Morningside Elementary School. So all of these things were kind of in the background. Now, what I've done is I've broken this down not by time necessarily, but by issue. It's the only way that makes sense to me. And I'm going to try to read what the contemporary era said on this different things. So the first question to me is, did Fort Campbell really place Hopkinsville off limits in military personnel or two military personnel during the early 1950s. And first, let's go back to 1942. The Fort Campbell had just opened. And this is what the Kentucky New Era said. Hopkinsville is glad you are here. Just in case you are not already aware of the fact, we want you to know that you are the biggest thing that has ever happened to us as a community. We want you to feel that you are welcome, that you are one of us, that the privileges of our community are your privileges, and that its inhabitants are your friends, and finally, that we will make every effort to see that you enjoy your stay while being stationed at Camp Campbell. And so then kind of the key question is, what happened over the next 10 years that we suddenly are looking at a federal grand jury report out of the meeting? I think it's also important to kind of think about that, a lot of these soldiers, we think Fort Campbell now is huge. It wasn't that big. It was a training facility. It was a camp. You get into this legal definition of what's a post, what's a camp, what's a fort. We're not going to get into that. But it was a camp. And it was a training facility. Back in the mid-40s, particularly during the Korean War, a lot of these soldiers came from all over the United States. And here they are in the segregated South. For a lot of the African Americans, LA or Chicago, that was a different experience. And it was just different. And it was a training facility. So a lot of these guys, they were either headed to Europe during World War II, or the next stop was Korea. And Chuck Henderson told me this. He just said they would train for 13 weeks, and if they were good, they'd get a break, and then they'd come over to Hopkinsville and have a good time. And you say, well, why Hopkinsville? Why not Clarksville? Best I can tell, and I talked to 5 or 6 people, and nobody can nail it down, Hopkinsville was wet. And Clarksville might have been wet, but I'm going to say Hopkinsville was very wet. I'll leave it at that. And then, if you think about it, it's kind of like kids going off to college. You're throwing all of these young soldiers who've never been away from home, they probably didn't have their families. It's alcohol, having a good time, these different places we talked about. You did have a combination, this is kind of from Chuck Henderson a little bit. You had a combination of North Christian coal miners, they're kind of rough bunch. You had South Christian farmers, they had something to prove. And then you had these soldiers. And, it's kind of inevitable that something's going to happen. And it did. So then what happened was, now we kind of get into what really happened here. In 1952, Fort Campbell said that their military policemen were going to no longer accompany Hopkinsville policemen patrolling Hopkinsville. And that was a real big move. And that was a real message that Fort Campbell was sending. And as a result, 8 Hopkinsville locations were placed off limits. And that was the same approach that they followed in Clarksville and Nashville. They would shut it off. Then what happened, and this is kind of inevitable, I guess, you did a spin job. It's kind of like PR work over here. So suddenly within 6 months, the commander is saying, we have excellent relations now between Fort Campbell and Hopkinsville. And then Mayor Coon, who was the mayor, he was one of the 3 city commissioners, and they made him mayor. He said in the New Era, nobody in Hopkinsville approved of any brutal treatment of soldiers by policemen, as written about in the federal grand jury report. At the same time, he stressed that he does not expect policemen to have to submit to unnecessary abuse when they make an arrest. So I think you had some mixed feelings there. And then just kind of want to wind this up pretty quickly. But later on, as the month progressed, the commanding general said, the less we say about this issue, the better. They're trying to shut it down. Then they said there is no area anywhere or relations between the military and the surrounding territory better than they are in Hopkinsville and Clarksville. And then sometimes you kind of laugh. All right, so then what happened? Here we go. These young guys they're used to a good time. And so one of the things that the city did, and Frank Lacey, we all remember Frank Lacey, he did his best. He helped lead the USO. The USO building is a building next to the Presbyterian Church on 9th Street. And here's what they said. that the Saturday night, here's what they offered them rather than beer, prostitution, and slot machines. Said the Saturday night free bingo games, they had 80 participants. They had a jukebox dance and a snack bar with the most popular events. And then on Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock, they had best for services. And so there you go. And then I'm going to say this real quick. How many of you remember where Tungets was? Tungets was out here where Gary Moore's House of Flowers is. Right out there between that and Bob Arnold's place out there. Well, there was still a lot going on. And so in August of '54, which would have been 2 years after that report, you had a group of Fort Campbell soldiers who went out to Tungets, which is kind of like Sonic, I guess, now. And they pulled local citizens out of the car and kind of roughed them up a little bit. And they just gave them a hard time. And then they brought them down here to the police station. And then the police station started fighting again down here. That's what the police were having to deal with a little bit. And then I thought this was kind of good. What was happening in Hopkinsville was happening probably at all military bases across the United States. Gambling, prostitution, and other things. And so the Department of Defense issued a survey. And here's what Fort Campbell said. There's no great amount of gambling or other vice in the vicinity of the military base. So the only reason somebody might be off limits is because of sanitation requirements. Now this was interesting. Fort Campbell further confirmed that prostitution was no longer a problem to the Fort Campbell area, although on paydays, prostitutes from surrounding cities, such as Chicago, come into this area. And I say that because I had never thought about it, realized that really running in the background is probably organized crime. All right? Whether it's at Fort Campbell, Fort Knox, certainly was at Fort Benning. They also talked about the Pachero gang, which apparently some of the soldiers might have had this tattoo, and that seemed to be a concern. So at the end of the day, though, by 1954, about 24 months after they supposedly put Hopkinsville off limits, they replaced them. So then the second question, and this is kind of where things get interesting a little bit. Well, why did Fort Campbell place Hopkinsville off limits? Right? I mean, what happened? And I've kind of mentioned running in the background with Henderson and Newport. Now, I'm not going to, they were notorious for this. So there's a lot of that. Now, I'm going to go back to 1946, just to show you this stuff just didn't happen overnight. And this is where a Fort Campbell physician wrote a letter to city government. And here's what he said. It concerned venereal diseases. And the officer claimed politics aids Hopkinsville vice. White and Negro prostitutes, brothels, and taverns are protected by impenetrable political protection. Cooperation from the Hopkinsville Police Department is practically non-existent, and the health officer meets constant rebuffs in trying to find VD contacts and hold them for treatment. And then this is what I thought was kind of funny too. So the city gets all upset in 1946. They had what they called an indignation meeting, I guess, where they discussed this. And but here's what a policeman said that kind of swung with the deal. Says, the policeman said that the city's brothel ordinance was one of the strictest in the state. So people said, okay, we're going to move on to something else. Now I'm going to tell you this next part this is what I believe is going on. Okay? And then we're going to back off of that. But at the end of the day, you got all of these locations that we talked about, all over town. And I think the whole town, the city officials, everybody knew what was going on. Yeah, they just did. They had to. So you had liquor to be available on the first floor, gambling probably on the first floor, maybe upstairs. Local cab companies provided transportation if you wanted to leave the premises. Or how many people remember the bus stop in front of the Dr. Pepper place over by the horseshoe? You go out there and we'll take you back to Fort Campbell. And then at each location, you can get liquor, a lot of moonshine here, a lot of slot machines, prostitution protection money. So there you go. what kind of world is this? And so, and something that J.D. Simmel said when I wrote that Chitlin paper, he talked about how the soldiers would come in some of the African American operations, and would try to take the dates of everybody who was local. So there was a lot of friction going on there. And then also, you guys said, well, what are the churches? Well, the churches, bottom line is, here I'm here preaching, some of the people that own the businesses or the different operations, they're sitting they're your parishioners. So I don't think there was a lot of moral pressure there going on. And I mentioned about organized crime. That is probably a whole other paper in itself that I'm not going to go after. But I do think that organized crime was involved a little bit, particularly in the northern tourist ports up here. And I had somebody that knew, they said, yeah, the guy from Chicago would come down on a regular basis and stay up there. Don't know whether the Chicago one was named after my folks or not. Well, I'll never drive by and I think that it wasn't. But they would come down and they would, track all this stuff. And you had individuals who, this one person, controlled the moonshine, the liquor business, from Henderson all the way to Guthrie, which was basically 41. See, that's what you had going up and down here in Chicago. So that was a lot of it. And then on this prostitution, I just want to mention that. New Era is talking about the cracking down of when officials termed the nightly pickup of soldiers by girls barely in their teens. The county today sentenced two 15-year-old girls to the reform school in sight of the local tourist court on the charge of being a nuisance. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Fort Campbell had a reason to be upset. And then there were 4 or 5 cases, which I'm not even going to get into. These were really brutal, but I think almost in today, they could have turned into a Trayvon Martin situation. One of the policemen shot an African-American soldier in the head while he was running away from the police court, from the police station down here. They stopped somebody else. I mean, there was just a lot of stuff going on there when that was involved. And I'm not going to go there. And then actually, some of those cases went to court, and the Christian County jury did return a $1,000 verdict against the wife of one of the soldiers for all of her behalf. And then all of a sudden, as you can imagine, some of the policemen, in fact, let's just say the police department, were getting very concerned with the criticism that they were taking. So they went on the record as saying 10 city police officers were quoted in the New Era. They felt that they stood alone while protecting the city. We get no protection or backing from anyone. The police chief added, they get no support from the city and little sympathy from the people. So it was, the town was starting to polarize a little bit. And then the police reached out and they brought in a union attorney to represent their interests. We'll talk about him in a little bit. And I'm going to say this very briefly. I want to run out of time here. But then what you had, you had Newport and Henderson. You had people running for office and come to Hopkinsville, stand on the courthouse steps, and they would talk about how we need to stop corruption. Do we have any Presbyterians in here? Well, back in, I thought this was interesting. There was a former Hopkinsville Presbyterian minister named Charles Dietz, and they moved him to Henderson. And he led the charge up there with vice and corruption and everything. And then he wrote a book in 1983, and I read that book. And that was really interesting about how widespread a lot of what we're talking about here, not just in Hopkinsville and elsewhere. And then I'm trying to say these were all the things that were going on. And it wasn't just Hoptown, because up in Hopkins County, in Madisonville and Burlington, they had slot machines at the Madisonville Country Club, the Eagles Club, the American Legion, and the VFW. And this is just kind of, I guess, just an acceptable way of doing things. So then, we got all this stuff going on. Fort Campbell just put you on double probation. What are you going to do about it? So then the city, about 350 citizens, they met at the old Hopkinsville Hospital, and they formed the Citizens for a Good Government Committee. And the leaders of that were Frank Yost, and a minister from Clarksville, and then the captain of the Salvation Army. He was very active in this. And they also quoted a Mr. Merritt, who was a tailor and a former city policeman, and he testified, so far as the police force is concerned, we don't have it. And the goal of the committee was to bring about a change in government, in city government, from the mayor commissioner to the mayor council form. And that's what we have now. This is a pretty strong statement. A couple of people said it. Kind of the quick of that was, it's going to be harder to bribe 12 people than it is 3. I think that was maybe their plan. Then we have the Rotarians in here. All right. Well, I thought this was really good. So poor old Dr. Payne, here he just gets out of Vanderbilt Med School. He, and how many of you remember old John Hart? Okay. I do too. And he represented the city commissioner for the government. So Dr. Payne and John Harden had a debate at the Rotary Club. In a place that said they had 75 people. And it just so happened that this is kind of a Perry Mason kind of moment. The very same day, Dr. Payne reaches over here and produces a copy of the federal grand jury report released in Paducah that day. All right. You got to wonder what's going on there. And so things really escalate because within 48 hours, Dr. Payne had been sued twice, about for $50,000 for libel. And all he did was read from that report. So you can imagine they were picking up there. And then all of a sudden, right after that, you had the Ministerial Association who weighed in. And the two churches that seemed to be the most active were the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church. I didn't see anything much about Baptists or Methodists. No, I'm just, you know, those were the two. And here's what they said. They wrote a letter. It says it seems to be a flagrant evidence of lax law authority. Examples included protection, robberies, the unsolved death of a man stuffed in a trunk, underage drinking, the use of narcotics by youth, poor city police pay, the sale of obscene literature, and the increase in prostitution in both businesses and residential districts. So, and then the federal grand jury report, here's what it said. They alleged bribes and payoffs for alleged bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, illegal whiskey, gambling joints, and this is the key part, the brutal and inhuman treatment of Fort Campbell soldiers. And that was a result of a 14-month, supposedly secret federal investigation that began in 1951. They listened to 15 witnesses from Hopkinsville. And who they zeroed in on were the city commissioners and the police department, pretty much. And then, I want to get legal on this thing. But the union attorney got involved, and he raised 3 really good questions. He said, first of all, that is a grand jury report. It's not in the indictments. Okay, think about that. Right? And here's what he said. He raised it, and he sent these all the way to the U.S. Attorney General, and best I can tell, he never got a reply. But he raised 3 pretty good questions. Why did an assistant attorney general call witnesses to Paducah to testify regarding alleged state law violations? Okay, this is all really unusual. Yeah, we got an attorney over here. Why would an accusation of alleged violations be made public without indictments being made? See, they just issued a report. And then was the date of making public the report was it predetermined by political considerations to influence a hotly contested political election on the change in the form of city government? Yeah, those are pretty good questions, and I don't think we're ever answered. So then all of a sudden, within the week, the Kentucky New Era jumps in here. They write a couple of editorials. One's called, and this is on the front page, okay, right on the back. They said, "We are on the spot. In time for sober thinking." And they both emphasize that Hopkinsville was not a hotbed of crime and was still the best town on earth. There seems to be some denial going on there. And it said to save the town's good reputation, officials needed to immediately act. So one of the first things they did was suspend 6 of the city's 10 policemen. And then they asked for a court of inquiry from Judge Iris B. Smith. And then they, again, just kind of a couple of other editorials said that Hopkinsville had a black eye across the nation as a city of crime and corruption. And they warned the committee to refrain from making wild accusations and follow the American plan of assuming that a man is innocent until proven guilty. And then they concluded by saying, We don't believe for a moment that this fair city is any hotbed of crime, and if we will all be calm, we can clear up the unsavory conditions that exist. We are still firm in our conviction that we have the best town on earth. All right. Some of the people I talked to said, bottom line is, New Era is not going to antagonize some of the business people that were kind of full of the shots on everything. But it is what it is. So in 1952, in November, the city voted, and it was 63%, 38% to change the city government. So that's how we ended up in Wynn. We became a city council form of government. Now, I'm not exactly sure what a report of inquiry is, but that's the first thing they did, and Judge Ira V. Smith, he conducted it, and he focused on allegations of prostitution, misfeasance, malfeasance, nonfeasance, gambling, slot machines, loitering, moonshine, liquor, stolen from the evidence room, the sale of obscene comic books, beer license violations, and the sale of unlicensed liquor. I can already tell we're going to go over it, and I apologize. But I got to tell you, this poor guy who ran the pawn shop and sold this obscene comic book, at the end of the day, he's about the only guy that got convicted. And I just said, I don't know about that. He did. I don't know who that guy was, but I feel sorry for him. And then all of a sudden the Chamber of Commerce jumps in here and they say, we cannot disassociate this entity, this entirely from the moral life of our city. And they kind of go on and say, we're in charge of 1,000 young men and we want to take care of them. And the chamber pledged that they would try to clear the chamber's name. So all of a sudden you had that first court of inquiry. But then, this kind of showed how big a deal this was. The Little Courier-Journal and other newspapers came down and they were reporting on this stuff. And they took a picture of a Courier-Journal walking up the grand jury room steps in the back of the courtroom, and somebody touched him. He turned around and yelled at him and said, "You can't touch me." You can just, see all this stuff going on. Said, "I'm within my constitutional rights. Take your hands off me." So they listened to 18 people, and they came back and indicted 6 policemen and some other things, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Then what happened is, whether it's the chamber, the ministerial association, or just people in general, they didn't think Judge Smith was doing a real good job. They thought some of, I think, reading between the lines, they thought not Judge Smith, but some of the other officials were maybe, not as diligent as maybe they should have been. I'll put it that way. And so then they initiated a special grand jury, right, which is the first time Hopkinsville had a special grand jury in 20 years. And then that led to a second special grand jury. Right? And that would have gone on from about, say, December all the way up until March or April. And then it kind of concluded. And then we'll inherit all of this, which is, again, all this drama in the background. So once Hopkinsville changed to city government, the Good Government Committee is saying, we want these changes now. But you can't do it now because, you can't have it legally. You had to wait till the November 54 election, right? The next one, if I'm right on this. And so then all of a sudden they get Selden Trimble. He's hired by the city. He goes and argues the case before the Court of Appeals, which is the Kentucky Supreme Court now, about what should happen. And so the Governor Weatherby is the one who suspended our charter, whatever you want to call it, for a couple of hours. And so during that time period, Hopkinsville did not have any form of government. And then he appoints some city council people to serve on a temporary basis. And I love when I read this, Judge Smith, he was much more quite a character. So by this time, I think he was kind of starting to take it personally. Here's what he said. This court does not think that Hopkinsville and Christian County should be treated like a captured province in Germany or Japan. And frankly, we do not agree with those who countenance such an attitude. And he then blasted the chamber by saying that the chamber preferred to assume that we are all cursed with sin and inequity like Solomon and Gomorrah, seemingly overawed by the military might and power of Fort County. And then he knew that this politics. He knew that the foreman was a farmer, and they were running over on these grand jurors. He had time limits on them. But he told the foreman that he had the discretion to extend the to because it was hog killing time. I'm not making this stuff up.
30 minutes.
Yeah?
30 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to have to pick this up a little bit. I will say that I'm still trying to figure out, how did this whole grand jury get going? Well, it looks like one of the main prosecutors was a guy named David Walls, who had graduated from Hopkinsville High School in 1940. It's kind of dry anyway. But there were a lot of legal things going on, playing for the year about who's in charge, when can you take over. You're running the city. Says, Mayor Coons said, we do not intend to make any appropriations and incur debts, take any other unusual actions, but the people must have some kind of government in the interim. And that's kind of the kind of stuff that's going on. And then I want to mention this also. And then the Citizens Committee for a Good Government, they ran their own ticket in mayor, and they didn't win. And then, Bonnie, I saw you back there. The Hopkinsville League of Women Voters confirmed that they would not support any political candidate or ticket. However, they were in favor of the city council form of government. So you kind of knew where they stood. And Bill Smith was the individual who ran for mayor on the good government ticket. And none were elected. And as there were no Republican candidates, the Democrats controlled and swept every local office. That's not surprising. So that kind of gets us to our fourth question here. Did anyone go to jail or pay a fine because of the court of inquiry on the two special grand juries or for federal civil rights violation? And I have to say, really, at the end of the day, anything major took place in federal court. It didn't take place locally. That doesn't surprise probably. It was not in Hopkinsville. And ran across a lawyer that I was not familiar with, W.R. Clark. He was a defense attorney in Hopkinsville, went to Washington Law School, must have been a pretty smart guy. He represented, I think, 9 of the policemen and people that were charged. That's what he did. And then the new era is kind of way back in here again. But I think this is worth reading. They quoted an out-of-town reporter who had come to Hopkinsville to report on all this stuff. And this is what the out-of-town reporter said. I never saw any town where so many good, honest people distrusted so many other good, honest people. And then the new era continued. Everybody in Hopkinsville agrees that vice and corruption should not exist. Nobody is arguing that it should not be stamped out immediately, wherever it exists. The only difference of opinion is how much vice and law violating is going on and who's doing it. The situation boils down to this. Either there is vice and corruption in Hopkinsville or there is not. If such rottenness exists, someone must know it. Somebody must have seen it or has first-hand knowledge of the same. If we can't produce or prove otherwise, let's admit that this is not such a bad town and then make a real effort to keep it that way in the future. We can spend the rest of our lives trying to justify the federal grand jury report. Because by this time it has been over a year. And I think people, the same as wear themselves out a little bit. Then some of you are going to remember Golly Lamont and Jesse Keith, later on the chamber. They continued this thing like I'm resigning from the chamber because I don't like the way they're doing things. You had that type of thing. So you had your second grand jury. You had a special prosecutor, I guess, from Murray, and they brought in a special judge from Louisville. And then the prosecutor by that time too, he was reaching out to the public saying, if you know anything about any of this, we want to talk to you. And I think by this time, either people had lawyered up or they just said, let's just, we got to do this. This is getting on. So then what happened to answer the question, well, what happened to some of these people? You had your court of inquiry. Those people had gone through the. So a couple of months later, basically, their lawyers were getting involved on procedural grounds, whether it was statute of limitations or just kind of nitpick itself a little bit, but they were being quashed for procedural reasons. And so the investigation, all three of them, ended in May of 1953. And so then you kind of ask, and one pleaded guilty on a misdemeanor charge. The cost to the state and county were approximately $3,500, and the fines assessed were $315. And the special prosecutor for Murray was paid $7 a day. And the Kentucky New Era summarized the state court convictions as basically a basement crack game and the sale of obscene comic books. It kind of played itself out. And then in perhaps the one serious conviction, I can tell you, some of the situations involving not only African American soldiers, but white soldiers in Fort Campbell, where they either were getting beat up or killed, and that was serious stuff. But here's what one of the city commissioners, this is what happened to him. He was found guilty in federal court after about 4 continuances. Okay, I mean, it just went on and on and on. And what had happened was a Fort Campbell officer said that a city commissioner physically and verbally abused the officer while the officer attempted to subpoena a Hopkinsville police officer involved in a traffic case. No big deal. But he said the city commissioner told him he would have to clear all subpoenas through the post-provost marshal's office. He said when he started to leave the police station, which is right over here, the former safety commissioner grabbed him by the shoulder, wheeled him around, and bodily took him into an adjoining office, locked the lower door, and cursed him several times. So at the end of the day, I think two or three of these commissioners were probably bad news, and they were the ones who, and they were in charge of public safety and law enforcement, and there was questionable things going on. But what happened to that city commissioner in this federal court? They fined him $250 in court costs, and his attorney, who was probably W.R. Clark, appealed to the community to pay his fine and legal costs. I mean, that takes a gut. And then you kind of say, well, what happened to Dr. Payne? What happened to those 2 lawsuits? But at the end of the day, like I said, Dr. Payne was sued twice. And one of the suits claimed that the false and derogatory statements were maliciously made in order to defame and ridicule the plaintiff in order to obtain votes for the council form of government. And this was kind of neat. And I think she may be watching tonight, and some of her classmates from the class of '68, Ann Payne, who was Dr. Payne's daughter, and her older sister, Carolyn, here's what they were doing. That they would have been 6 and 2, I think. So this would have been Carolyn. They had just bought a house on Moreland Drive. All of this is going on. And, they were worried as little girls, are we going to lose our house? Yeah. I mean, this is a stressful time. And speaking of Moreland Drive, I forgot to mention this, and I'm not going to go back and find it. But this is one of the things that is united people. Jimmy, you may know where 116 Moreland is. Well, 116 Moreland Drive, one strange night, they could smell sour mash coming out of the basement. And the neighbors reported this, and somebody was running a moonshine operation at the bottom of Moreland Drive. And so that was kind of like, again, all the gloves were off. People were just saying, we got to stop this thing. So I drove by 116 Moreland Drive just to see what it was. I bet you they don't know. They don't have the idea how famous their house is. So Dr. Payne, which he should have, the case never should have been filed, quite frankly. But Judge Smith said that it's absolute privilege. All he did was read the results of a federal grand jury report. That's all he did, and then it was absolutely privileged. But just to show you, the Judge Smith had a little edge on it a little bit. He's kind of wound things up. He expressed a strong opinion of the overall charges of vice and corruption in Hopkinsville. Here's what he said. In conclusion, we can only add that while the defendant he's talking about Dr. Payne, that the defendant may use the cloak of privilege as against the financial effects of an action for slander. This cloak can afford him no protection against the shrill winds of his own conscience. There is one ancient commandment that can never be violated with impunity. Thou shalt not bear false witness. The just censure of fair-minded men will finally fall upon the head of him who deals in the irresponsible utterance, the misleading headline, and the elastic interference, no matter how righteous he may contend his cause to be. And that's pretty strong. I just can't imagine a sitting judge today being that vocal about something. Maybe they would. And then just to show you that Dr. Payne and his family were still held in the highest regard, Miss Gay Payne was recognized as the 1954 as Hopkinsville's Lady of the Year by the Beta Sigma Phi sorority. And then also, so you'll know, the lawsuits had also been filed against the Courier Journal, Evansville Courier, Nashville, Tennessee, and Nashville Banner. And those suits were they were dismissed as well under absolute privilege because they didn't look the same. So, I've got a couple of questions. Let me ask you. We're good. Wound that up quicker than I thought I would. And again, if you want to read a lot of stuff that I did leave out.
I've lived here 33 years now, and I came into town about the time the Rotary auction was going on. So everybody got the solicitation packages. I was coming in kind of late, so I got the bottom.
Yeah, hey, what?
Let's go up there. That's okay. Right here. So I got the bottom of the list for the solicitations, and I was doing most of my calls at night, so I drove back and forth to Lexington. And lo and behold, one of them that was in there was, I noticed on the list, the Glow Bar. And keep in mind this was night. So I took it, being a diligent notarian, I went at night to the Glow Bar, just right across over here by the Episcopal Church.
Yep.
And made my solicitation call, and he pulled out a $100 bill for the Century Club out of his cash register. Nicest guy in the world. And I turned around and I turned back into Rotary and he said, "You did what?" But I saw that in here. I meant it sometime before they tore it down. Just go give it a break. Go bar in and stuff and attach it.
There, as you can tell, there were a lot of bars, a lot of tourist courts in Hopkinsville at the time. Anybody else? Have you heard any stories from your parents or grandparents?
I have two stories. My father, Dan Coward, was born in 32, and he said that when he was a little boy, he remembered caravans or motors of the machine guns and the tents and all the military travel vehicles.
Now, what year would that have been?
Probably 1941 or something like that, or 40.
Okay, so that's when Fort Campbell was just started.
It was called Camp Campbell.
Yeah.
And then, as a realtor, I have people coming back into Hopkinsville because they had so much fun here at the Ivory Tower. And so they like people just moving back in because this is where they want to sell.
Well, it's funny you say that because I happened to be at the Veterans Cemetery one day, and this soldier from Fort Campbell, we got to talking, and he said pretty much the same thing. He just said, "I had a lot of good times in Hopkinsville." You could tell he was thinking about it. Sure. Okay.
First financial.
Yeah. Well, the Ivory Tower, which I didn't realize, the first one was probably down here on Clay Street, which is your flood over there. And then I guess they made enough money or whatever. You know where the Heritage Bank next to the other. Well, that's where the Ivory Tower was. And I can assure you that by the 60s and 70s, that just wasn't for soldiers.
It was known as the menopause lab. That's what it was called.
So, like, what happened to the body in the trunk?
Oh.
I'm very concerned about the murders that are just and people were killed. Like it's just like a meh.
Well, let's ask the question about what happened to the man in the trunk. That was the only time I ever saw that many.
Well, in the report that ran in the Courier Journal, I mean, it mentions that soldiers were beaten and even killed. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like that is much more of a statement.
It sounds like you had, I'm sorry. No, it sounds like you had very little information on that. Like, it sounds like, which is scary. I think,
Yeah, like,
it's like
you would think that would
some
be
serious
relatable.
stuff happened that you didn't have much in the archives to define, but some stuff is still, it was just reported very small, like anecdotally, like, oh yeah, by the way, someone got killed this weekend. Okay?
Well, and I wanted to say this, if you were to go through and start reading these online newspapers, here's what you're going to see, unless it's totally this. You may go 10 or 15 days, they're all there. And then suddenly a couple of them just disappear. They're just not there. So some of the stuff that I've said, I can back it up, but then I might have very well the next day something else happened that I just don't know about. And I only read the first pages. I didn't sit there and read through all these things either. I will say this. I forgot about this. And again, this is an out attorney. I'm pretty careful when I say this. It's organized crime stuff. But the guy that seemed to be right at the forefront, and I went online and I was checking, and he did own the Fontaine Blue. And that's a magnet. It's hanging on our refrigerator. So, and then he also owned the Manhattan Bar. And he owned, supposedly his house up in Madisonville, if you went into it down in the basement, it was a casino. And again, you're wondering, everybody knows this, and that's when you go back to this protection, and everybody's just kind of looking the other way. Yes, sir.
I can't prove any of this. When I first came back to practice, I practiced with Ben Wright. I first practiced with Ben Wright, and he had some elderly clients who were prominent businessmen during this time. And I asked them about something. I won't reveal my clients' names or anything, but several of these businessmen who everybody would know said that the genesis of this was that the Hopkinsville community did not want their young ladies to be taken advantage of by soldiers, and that they didn't have much money, and they really didn't want them in town. They wanted officers to come and move here because they had money to spend and could buy a home, but they didn't want the enlisted to come to Hopkinsville. And that was the genesis for the police brutalizing soldiers, was to make it clear that the enlisted should not come to Hopkinsville and molest our daughters. And so I did a little research. It's been some years ago, so I can't remember exactly the details, but about this time, about 1950, Hopkinsville I believe, was the third largest city in Kentucky. And I think it was around 27 to 30,000 population, I believe, not much different than it is now. And Clarksville was smaller than Hopkinsville at that time. And they encouraged the soldiers, the enlisted, to come that way. So that you can see the evidence of it when you go outside Gate 4, you turn right, and there's nothing but stores and residences and everything all the way to downtown Clarksville. And that used to be just farmland all the way till you got down to the river there going into downtown Clarksville. And it was farmland all the way to Hopkinsville. Now there are 200,000 people or whatever, and we're within 5,000 people of what we were in the 1950s. And I think we're like, the 8th largest city in Kentucky, 7th or 8th. So we've dropped from, I think, 3rd to 7th or 8th, and we're about the same number of people as we were then. And Clarksville's 10 times the size it was, and it's non-stop development all the way from Fort Campbell to Clarksville.
And it started.
well,
Yeah.
Tommy, I'm so glad you said that.
That was going to be my question.
Okay, no, I intentionally did not go into that. Because William Carter says you don't go from teaching to preaching. But I'm just going to back up what you just said. In 1950, Montgomery County had 42,000 people, and Christian County had 41,000. And so you kind of say, well, what happened in the meantime? Yes, sir.
Well, no, I mean, I think the point of, I'm military, so I use PCS here, but PCS can be small town, small North Carolina resort town. What they had was the special forces phenomenon. Just, I'll be honest, I live in Clarksville. You don't want to live in Clarksville. It's like I'd much rather live here. And I think if the city does some things to modernize, this could be the Southern Pines effect. I don't golf. I don't even near golf. It's sort of Pinehurst Resort. Pinehurst Resort, Southern Pines. It's 30 minutes outside of Fayetteville. Clarksville is like a nicer Fayetteville. They're both terrible places. I'll just say. But I think it raises a good point when you talk, and it's kind of off subject, but that the city's been in decline, but they do things like, I know I hate to put, like, now there's liquor on Sundays, but you get more businesses because you'll get people, but you've got, for example, the 50 people and the pilots, I can't even name, they usually stay in one place. They don't bounce around as much all the time. My point is like, they would probably rather come to a place like this and live in Clarkson. I know I would got.
Yay!
I should have bought a house. I should have bought a house where they went to. I'm sorry. But I hadn't been here yet, and the fixed age was awesome. It's like, well, I don't know, it's the market taking off. But yeah, I can get that house.
Tyler, again, you're right, because I did read the paragraph, and that's what the Kentucky News said. We want the officers, and we don't want the enlisted people.
I'll tell you when it changed. In 1973, when we had the all-volunteer military and they had to raise salaries so that enlisted people suddenly made good money, and we suddenly wanted their money here, and that's when it started to change. The attitude of Hopkinsville to the military was after the all-volunteer military, and you had more money in the pockets of every soldier.
Especially those Victor guys. Those Victor guys.
Yes.
Yes.
Significant.
Alyssa, how are we doing on time?
Hey, it's your show.
All right, well, I'm going to throw out 4 questions. All right, unless somebody else. First question is, because I don't know what this answer is, who or what entity initiated the Paducah Federal Grand Jury report? What's your gut instinct? Who did that? Who pulled it off?
Alvin Barkley had something to do with this somewhere, I got a feeling.
That's right. Yeah, he was vice president. Well, he was senator at the time, he was vice president. Well, I just tell you, I think Fort Campbell said enough. And I think they had the political connections to issue a grand jury report, not indictments, and they basically leveraged, of course, Hopkinsville to do something. I think that's
Shame.
They changed it at the end of the day. They said, we tried, we argued, we begged, and you guys haven't done anything. So I think that's what happened. Now let me ask you this, because I've never heard about this grand jury report. It went on for about 18 months, 14 months. How secret do you think that grand jury report was on the streets of Hopkinsville? Because they interviewed about 15 people. I mean, people knew what was going on. And I think behind the scenes, that's where Dr. Payne and Mr. Yost and some of these people. And I want to say this too. Just, when the governor Weatherby appointed the 12 city council people, there were 10 white, 10 black. Okay, you had Mr. Whitney, and I just can't remember the other gentleman's name.
Here's a snort.
Well, it's a short step. I don't know. But I'm just, because a lot of these things we're talking about were also going on in the African American community. Right? It is what it is. Now, again, this is just from a strategy standpoint. In the retrospect, should the Citizens for a Good Government Committee, should they have attempted to just simply not re-elect the 3 city commissioners rather than to basically overhaul the entire city form of government, which is what they did? I mean, that was a pretty bold move. It was almost like a coup. And I actually called up the Kentucky League of Cities and I asked them that question and they never responded. Go figure that.
Well, I think what you said earlier, that it was harder to bribe 12 than 3. So I think without the changeover, it would have been the same thing under a different name, right?
Yeah.
Or it could have been, we'll say.
Well, and that argument about the police department, because I think that's really what the problem for. I mean, that's what Judge John Harden said. You're not going to get a better police department by having a different form of government. You're just not. All right, last question. Again, I really want to hear from you guys, but I'll ask this question. Today, who or what entity serves as the moral compass of Hopkinsville? That's Dan Kemp's term, like moral compass. I mean, do you expect it from city government or county government? Or individuals like Dr. Payne and people who step up? Or, where's that moral compass? I don't know. So, any questions? I was expecting a lot of memories tonight.
I got something about Mr. Whitney.
Yeah.
So in 2001.
Well, Jennifer, can you come up here? Just because I know there's some people who want to hear what everybody has to say.
I think it was in the spring of 2001, a professor named Jack Glazier came to Hopkinsville for the first time, and he was thinking about doing a study of race and memory here, and it was his first visit to see if that was going to be possible. A lot of y'all met Jack Glazier, and he eventually wrote a book called Been Coming Through Some Hard Times. But the first day he was here, he ended up at the newspaper, and I ended up meeting him and agreeing to drive him around Hopkinsville and just help him get his bearings and show him neighborhoods. We stopped at Effie Whitney's real estate office, and Mr. Whitney told us a story that day about, in his words, he said, the white town fathers came to him and asked him if he would support a new form of government with 12 council members, and he described how it all played out and how significant it was to ensure that we had minority representation in our city government. It probably would have not happened for many years if we only had 3 or 4 commissioners, but he had a very strong memory of that. Also, I wanted to mention that there's about 4 bars on your list: the Glow Bar, the Cinderella, the Alibi Club, and the Ivory Tower, that were frequently showed up in police reports when I started running the police beat for the New Era in the late 80s. They were still very active places.
Was the police chief Green lady?
I don't know.
It was green.
No.
Green something.
Real, I think.
Greenwell.
That, during this time, that
Yeah.
was also the
He
Kelly
replaced the other
Greenhead thing that's going on at the same time.
Now, Greenwell was appointed
After this other
after the other chief was taken out.
I think it was Greenway.
field.
But
Field. It was Greenfield.
I went to school with his brother, his son, Nick Green.
If you noticed,
Something like that.
if you noticed, I never mentioned anyone's name.
Except for
That was by design.
you can't libel someone that's dead.
Yes, sir.
Well, Hoptown ended before Campbell came in, before Campbell. It's a farming community, I didn't listen to you.
That's a good question. Break your own up. Tell us about it.
I don't know the same age.
George is right. No, I think at the time it was like the world's biggest tobacco market. You know, that was kind of our claim to fame. Anything else? So we're going to shut this thing down. So what we've learned, this whole thing started off is, did they shut Hopkinsville down and have tanks on the outside of town? And the answer is no. But you had everything from moonshine on Moreland Drive to people getting stuck in floats. I tell you what, listen, I keep thinking of these stories at the end of it. I'm going to tell you one last story about how the real world worked. So because of Henderson and Newport, the FBI on a particular night raided all of these bars and things for slot machines. Now, you gotta laugh. They found 46 in Hopkinsville. One of them was still in the crate from 1948. But they weren't in operation. They were all in storage.
Yeah.
And it's Chip Miles, my neighbor, said, I tell him that, he goes, sounded like there was a leak.
I'm a new resident. I moved from St. Louis to Hopkinsville to get away from crime.
Welcome.
So it's a real eye-opener for me. But I will say this, that in St. Louis, my husband and I owned a business, and our clients, when we told them we were retiring and moving to Hopkinsville, some of them who had been Vietnam veterans and had been stationed at Fort Campbell for training would get this really goofy grin on their faces, and then they'd say, well, is such and such still there? I have great memories. And I think, what? So now, you've answered a lot of questions I had, because why are all these Vietnam veterans so happy?
concerning the steel on
Oh,
Yeah.
Tell us.
grade school. And when we were one day, had all the steel pipes running around all over the yard, getting ready, setting it up. And then even started smelling the mash. Coming in at night, taking it out.
On the house then.
It's, well, Larry Whitmer lived in a darker brick house, and then this Stewart, who was the manager of the Alhambra Theater, he lived.
And then I think a lot of this material, and it's all there, it's in the Kentucky era, because otherwise people really didn't want to talk about this, which I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, let's say anything else.
Thank y'all for coming. We'll do it again the last Thursday of June.